Moving on to the second half of the book, the author starts chapter 5 with this big idea of IRB and informed consent. So IRB is the Institutional Review Board, and they oversee pretty much all research that has to do with human subjects or not. There are things that are exempt from IRB, but whenever you're dealing with human subjects, which interviewing definitely is, you're absolutely going to need IRB approval. And so it starts off with kind of a reasoning why, a rationale. In the 20th century, human rights violations with research, there were a tremendous amount. From the Nuremberg trials in Germany, there were some other pretty awful studies coming out of Stanford as well. So it'll be interesting if you want to look that up. But because of these human rights violations with human subjects and research, that caused this Belmont report to come out. It was essentially this commission that came together that oversees research, and it wanted to establish 3 basic ethical principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Those ideas really should be at the heart of any research that people are doing with human subjects. IRBs are formed across all research institutions, so every university that pumps out research will also have an independent IRB attached to it. There's different members who consist of these committees, from college professors to outside independent analysts. But essentially, they come together, they look at these research pieces, and they want to make sure that, one, it's not harmful to the participants. And even nowadays in the 21st century, they're really looking for it to benefit those participants and move their identity forward with equity and other things that I'll get to just a few minutes here. It also covered the informed consent, which is essentially a participant agreeing to the research that they're engaging in. And so there's 8 major parts. I'll let you take a look at those right there. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. But these are the components that comprise of the informed consent. The person signing up has to know about each one of these 8 items before they will sign and agree, and before IRB will approve you doing research with those individuals and being able to publish those things. Chapter 6 talks more about technique. It goes from appropriate consent and informed consent, IRB, to technique with interviewing. And when you're interviewing, there's really a lot of different kind of styles that come into play. But the big thing that they really wanted to stress in this section was that you need to listen more and talk less. They find that a lot of people interviewing, especially new interviewers, will try to talk more and ask more questions and ask more clarifying things and digging deeper, when you really want to give that interviewee an opportunity to kind of express what they know, build on what they've heard before, and kind of expand and explore those ideas again. When you're listening, they mentioned 3 different things that you not only want to listen to what the participant's saying, but you also want to listen for that inner voice. This is different than that outer voice. That outer voice is what you hear when people talk in a group. When people talk in a group, they're often guarded. They're not going to say their exact truth for the fear that their peers or the other members of the group might view them in a negative way. So their inner voice is kind of that ultra truth, that those things that they might only think to themselves or say to themselves, but in a larger group, they might keep to themselves. And then again, you also want to be able to listen while remaining aware of the process, keeping your time down, making sure you're asking those follow-up questions. You're adding to that piece. So not only are you listening to what they're saying, you're hearing the content come out of their voice, but you are also picking up on that whole process, making sure you are abiding by that whole interview structure or unstructured, semi-structured, whatever kind of interview style you set up. With structured and unstructured interviews, you definitely want to make sure you're adding follow-up questions. If it's a super structured interview, you're not going to have that flexibility to add those follow-up questions. But if it's semi-structured or unstructured, you are going to have that chance to ask those follow-up questions, to dig deeper. But remember, talk less. Don't interrupt the person speaking. Allow them to really say their what they're thinking, what's on their mind, and ask them to expand on it. Ask them to explore. Instead of probing, the author kind of mentioned they don't really like this word probing, but instead of probing for information, you want that individual to explore. Two different strategies they said that you could help with this is often acting as a storytelling or as if I'm a someone else strategy. So the storytelling strategy is where you ask the participant to kind of tell you a story. Who are the characters? What's the rising action? What was the conflict? And you really want to have them kind of remember that way. There's also another strategy called as if I'm someone else. So you pretend, or you ask the person that you're interviewing to pretend that you are someone else. Okay, pretend I am, your baseball coach, or pretend I'm your, math teacher, or pretend I am, the principal at your school. And so if you kind of frame it that way, oftentimes they'll have different details, they'll have a different perspective, and sometimes you can get better information or more information out of that. And then last but not least, you want to limit your own interactions. Don't try to include your own stories too much. Don't try to personalize it. You do want to make that connection. You do want to have that rapport with the interviewee, but you really don't want to dominate the conversation with all of your own information. Moving on to chapter 7, it is about that relationship. Just as I was mentioning in chapter 6, you do want to build that social relationship. You do want to have that rapport with that interviewee, but you don't want to dominate the conversation. This is where interviewing becomes much more of an art, where you're trying to develop that relationship, but you're not trying to dominate the conversation. The author here talks about building a we rapport. And so that's essentially saying you and I are in this together. We are a team here, and we're going to be working together in this. Now, when you're trying to build those relationships, it's really important to recognize the relationships with power with interviewing. There's this inherent power dynamic where the person asking the questions historically has kind of asked direct questions. Okay, what's A? What's B? What's C? Do you have the answer to X? Do you have the answer to Y? In this situation, it's really important to understand that there's issues with power and those power dynamics, the race and ethnicity, the gender, class, hierarchy, status, age, the elites of these individuals. You want to make sure you're recognizing those power dynamics and you are trying to level the playing field and make it as equitable as possible. You want to make sure when you're going through these questions and you're identifying these power that you definitely let the interviewee know what's private, what's personal, and what's public experiences. You don't want them to share too much where they might feel that they've overshared later, but you do want to make sure you're getting the good details about the information that you're looking for. Well, when you're building a relationship, the really two things you want to focus on are the last two that you see on that list, which are reciprocity and equity. There has to be a give and take. You can't just take if you are interviewing. You have to be able to give back to the person that you've interviewed and make sure that process is equitable. When we're talking about equity, we're talking about scheduling. Hey, I can't interview at this time. Can you meet at this time? Or breaks. Hey, it's really strenuous doing a 30-minute interview. Do you mind if we do maybe 3 10-minute interviews? You really want to make sure you're building that into the interview process. Or sometimes the interviewee may feel cheated, or they may feel that they've been used or abused in the situation. And that's definitely not what we want. Chapter 8 moves on to analyzing, interpreting, and sharing the material. The big thing here is managing the data. Managing. This is tough, people. Paying attention to the order of detail. How did you label that information? Where did you file it? Did you document it in the correct way? The author stresses this throughout the entire chapter, that the more time you spend up front preparing, showing attention to detail, having all of those things organized, you will save hours and hours and hours of frustration later on. They make the point that you want to keep the interviews and the analyses separate. Sometimes during the interview, you want to, make sense of what you're hearing. Instead of just getting the raw content, writing it down and analyzing it later, sometimes interviewers get in trouble where they try to analyze in the process. As the person's speaking, they're analyzing it. And you really want to try to avoid that. So just take the interview, get the raw information, get your content, and then try to analyze it later after you've coded it, you've recorded it, transcribed it, and then you've coded it. That'll help you really, really take a look. a better look at it. There's two basic ways to share interview data. One is that you profile individual participants and then you group them into categories. So say I have, maybe 3 people with brown hair, 2 people with black hair, and 4 people with blonde hair. Okay, I've divided the individual participants. Now I've grouped them into hair color. So I've grouped them into categories. The second way is that you could mark individual passages, group these categories, and then study the categories for themes. So maybe we have 3 participants, John, Susie, and Billy. And each one of these individuals mentions something about power when we're asking them questions. So in the individual passages, I would mark power, and I'm going to highlight that idea. I'm then going to group these sentences where they use the word power into the power category. Then I'm going to study that theme. Okay, are they talking about who has power? Are they talking about who doesn't have power? Are they talking about who wants power? So in that situation, I would really identify their passages, then group them into categories, then study the categories for themes. When you're analyzing data, there's a bunch of computer-assisted technology out there. This one, computer-assisted qual data analysis software, can certainly help you organize, code, keep things in a good place, but be careful. There's misconceptions, there's coding traps. Some people work better with pen and paper. So you want to make sure that's a technology right for you before you really dive all into it. And then last but not least, chapter 9 goes over the ethics. This is really about, doing good work, carrying out your tasks well and rightly. You want to make sure you have equity with your participants, you're giving them reciprocity, and you're treating them with dignity. At the end of the day, the big thing is that we want to support and enhance our participants' dignity. We certainly want to build them up. We want to make sure we are doing all research ethically. So I want to end on a quote from Aristotle. It mentions this in the beginning of the text. I may have quoted him, a word or two wrong, but he essentially struggles with this idea where it says, what does it mean to act virtuously? And I'm going to ask you that now. I want you to pause for a second and really think to yourself, what does it mean to act virtuously? And this is an idea Aristotle struggled with. In the chapter, it goes over some of his struggles, but I'm very interested to hear what you all have to say.